this was argued to argue basically what we were saying before. Now we have really good evidence that lowering blood cholesterol levels will lower the risk of heart disease. Therefore, we can do that by taking the animal fats out of the diet. And this is exactly how Time magazine interpreted this. In 1984, they ran a cover article that said, it was titled "Hold the Eggs in Butter," and they said that cholesterol is finally proved deadly and our diet may never be the same. They said finally, after 23 years of recommending taking the animal fat out of the diet and adding the vegetable oils, the American Heart Association is finally having the evidence to back that up, and they've been right all along. But what was the problem with this interpretation? What was the coronary primary prevention trial testing? What was the treatment? A drug, right? Was there any eggs in the coronary primary prevention trial? Was there any butter? Was there any bacon? No, these foods weren't there. So this trial was not a trial of the diet-heart hypothesis, and this interpretation was never valid. Nevertheless, moving on into our own day in recent years, the American Heart Association is pushing this idea of replacing animal fats with high PUFA vegetable oils with ever greater vigor. In 2009, they published a science advisory where they said that they support an omega-6 PUFA intake of at least 5 to 10% of energy in the context of other lifestyle and dietary recommendations. To reduce omega-6 PUFA intakes, they said, from their current levels would be more likely to increase than to decrease the risk for coronary heart disease. I would like to emphasize two words. They said at least 5% to 10% of energy, and they said this was only for omega-6 PUFAs. So you have your bottle of soybean oil, right? You have omega-6 PUFAs. What else do you have? Omega-3 PUFAs, right? So they're saying at least 5 to 10%. That could be 12, 13, 14% total PUFAs. Way above the 2% PUFAs that we saw in the tropical island groups that were free of heart disease. Way more. But they said at least. And then they said, in fact, the data also suggests that higher intakes appear to be safe and may be even more beneficial as part of a low saturated fat, low cholesterol diet. So what they're saying is, hey folks, let's have a PUFA party. Just wash away your cardiovascular concerns in swigs of soybean oil. Let's have some fun, right? Let's push those PUFA intakes as high as we can. 14%, 15%. We could see some drinking games here. We'd have a competition. This is the kind of PUFA intakes that the American Heart Association is saying we should have. Well, we could understand that they would say this in 1961 when they didn't have any evidence for it. At least when they had no evidence, it was excusable, because we could say, okay, they want to make a best guess. They have to recommend something, so they can recommend their best guess, right? It's just a best guess. But it's much less, this type of nonsense is much less excusable now that we have long-term, double-blind, randomized clinical trials testing this idea, and we can see that these trials miserably fail to support it and suggest, if anything, that at least this idea of replacing animal fats with vegetable oils is dangerous. So I'd like to take a look at these trials today, and I have two criteria for including them. One is that they're a randomized controlled trial, meaning that the subjects were randomly assigned to either animal fat or vegetable oil, and that's because randomization is the key criterion for inferring cause and effect. And the other is that they're a single factor intervention, replacing animal fat or saturated plant fats with high PUFA vegetable oils, and that's because if we change 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 things at once, we have no idea what thing or group of things is having the effect. Does that sound fair? All right. Well, that means that I'm going to exclude from this analysis several commonly cited but improperly controlled vegetable oil trials, of which, at least some of which, the American Heart Association is very fond. These include the Oslo Diet Heart Study, because the treatment in this study included increased fruits and vegetables and distribution of free cod liver oil, which of course is an animal fat. I'm going to exclude the STARS trial because the treatment included increased fruits and vegetables and nutritional counseling. The Lion Diet Heart Study because it included bread, root vegetables, green vegetables, fruit, and fish. The DART-1 trial because it involved a decrease in total fat. And this is the one trial that I could justify including despite the decrease in total fat, because I think this is the least confounding factor, but it really wouldn't make a difference because this trial was fairly unsuccessful in getting the patients to change their diets in the first place, and in any case it was not successful in reducing the risk of heart disease, so it wouldn't make a difference if I included it or not. And then finally, the Finnish mental hospital study, which is often cited as a randomized controlled trial but isn't one, because in a randomized controlled trial you need to randomly allocate individual patients to at least 2 groups, then you need to have more than 1 person in the group. But the Finnish mental hospital study randomly allocated 2 hospitals to different diets and had 1 hospital in each group, so there's no way you could possibly call that randomization. And they put each hospital on a different diet, and after a few years they switched it. So of course these 2 different hospitals are in totally different areas. They have totally different demographics, all kinds of differences, including the fact that in the one arm of the trial where there was a reduced risk of heart disease, it was where there was a very high administration in the other hospital of a particular antipsychotic medication that is cardiotoxic, meaning it causes heart disease. So you can see that there's a lot of confounding in this study, and it can't possibly be included in this type of analysis. So let's have some fun looking at the 6 trials that do qualify. In 1965, Rose and colleagues published the first ever vegetable oil substitution trial, where they had a control group that ate the normal diet and 2 other groups that reduced the fat in their diet, mostly coming from animal fat, dairy and meat and so on, and they were given a supplement of either olive oil or corn oil. And as you can see here, it just barely came to the borderline of statistical significance. The corn oil group had twice as many cardiac events as the control group, and the olive oil group was in between. So the investigators concluded that under the circumstances of this trial, corn oil cannot be recommended as a treatment of ischemic heart disease. It is most unlikely to be beneficial, and it is possibly harmful. Does that sound like a fair conclusion? All right, well, wait till you see the next study. In the Sydney Diet Heart Study, they did the same thing, but it was a much larger study. It was a longer study, and they did achieve statistical significance. And they had 2 diets that were similar total fat content, but one was really high in PUFAs, the other was lower in PUFAs and higher in animal fats. And you can see the survival plotted over time here. The dotted line is the high PUFA diet, so you can see that there are fewer people alive during most of the course of the study, and that remains by the end of the study. And overall, the substitution of vegetable oils for animal fats increased mortality by about 40%. Now, if there were one thing in this study that you would say was bad, what would you say it was? The PUFAs, right? Because they're killing people? Is that fair? All right, well, you can see that the approach that these investigators used to interpret their own evidence was quite different from the last group of investigators, and they concluded that men who have had myocardial infarction are not a good choice for testing the lipid hypothesis. So they didn't see a problem with the PUFAs, but they saw either a problem with their study design or with the men. These men aren't really working right. They should be living longer. All right, moving on to the St. Vincent's Hospital study. This is a pretty amusing scenario. If you like the last one, you should probably like this one. The original plan, the original intention was to put 100 men on a 28% fat diet and compare peanut oils and coconut oils in one group to corn and safflower oils in the other group. Peanut and coconut oil are relatively high in saturated fat. Corn and safflower oil are relatively high in PUFA. So these are all plant fats, but this is the traditional fats versus the modern high PUFA vegetable oils. They were supposed to carry this study on for 10 years, but they published a preliminary analysis after 5 years. And you can see that there were 5 deaths in the high PUFA group, and there were 4 deaths in the peanut and coconut oil group. Not a very big difference, very hard to say whether that's random chance or some real effect. But what would you want to know?